fact that Australia is among the lowest taxed countries in the OECD. Can the Prime Minister confirm these reports are true, and whether the government intends to pursue policies that will continue to ensure that Australia remains a low-tax country by world standards?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Australia has, from memory at the moment, I think the federal government's tax to GDP is about 23.6%. I can't remember it was last that low. It must have been in the 1960s. And even if you add in the revenue base of the states, and well, we weren't doing quite the things then that we're doing today, as a matter of fact. Order. Healthcare, education, technical and further education, environment, sport, all sorts of areas. Mr. Speaker, and even if one puts in the revenue share of the states, Australia is the second lowest tax country in the OECD, from memory a decimal point away from the lowest, which is the United States, sharing, I think, second lowest place with Japan on the last statistics that I saw. And the government has, through the 1980s, provided tax cuts so as to keep that tax to GDP share within those sorts of ranges. In fact, we've had it coming down. Now, of course, revenue is down also at the moment because of the impact of the recession in years past on business, particularly in relation to companies, and also because of the fact that the economy has been growing much more slowly, and therefore receipts have been growing commensurately slowly, and the share is down. We'll be following the policy we've been following, that is to keep Australia a low-tax country, and not to be following, may I say, Mr. Speaker, the policy of the opposition, which would have made it a very much higher tax country, collecting a $24 billion net $18 billion GST. And I notice now, Mr. Speaker, we actually had a question at question time from the Shadow Treasurer asking about tax policy on this side of the House when they're walking around endorsing a policy with a $24 billion hole in it, with an $18 billion net hole after you abolish the wholesale sales tax. The Leader of the Opposition said last week, we're reviewing all elements of fight back, apart from, of course, the GST, the life of which we terminated last week. And he terminated, of course, $18 billion net proceeds from the GST, yet still has all the funding commitments of his fight back policy, including tax cuts, which are supposedly to be funded under their policies. He said he's sticking to fight back, but not with the GST. So he had a $6 to $10 billion funding hole in his original policy. What has he got now? 6 to 10 billion, and add to that 18 billion. Add to that 18 billion. Oh no, up. Here they are, up asking a question. And who was in there arguing for the immediate abandonment of the GST? Mr. Howard, Mr. McLaughlin, Mr. Downer, who asked the question today, Mr. Moore, Mr. Hall, and those in favour of retaining it, Mr. Bohm, Mr. Carlton, Mr. Short, Mr. Charles. So there's obviously great variance of view in the opposition about a goods and services tax. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the opposition over there are, as usual, not looking at their policies, not looking at the big picture. What we're finding back here on the first day, after palely loitering over there, or barely loitering, should I say, they're back there on, of all things, paid television policy, and yet today we find their Shadow Minister actually endorsing the policy, saying, well, we can do it for a fraction of that price.
The Prime Minister might resume his seat. The Honourable Member is on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I raise a point of order under Standing Order 145 relevance. The Prime Minister was asked a question from his own backbench about Australia being a low-tax country and comparison with the OECD. It is not relevant. It's not relevant in my submission, Mr. Speaker, for the Prime Minister to now be spending something like 3 minutes talking about policies of the opposition prior to the previous election. I ask you to rule him out of order or bring him back to the question.
Order. There is no point of order. Speakers consistently have suggested that if members of this chamber want to discuss the question of relevance, that the Procedures Committee is the appropriate way to deal with this, and it is in their hands. To date, that simply has not happened. The Prime Minister.
Speaker, Mr Speaker, and not only is there no focus on these things, but back into bad habits. Last week the Leader of the Opposition was saying we risk having an exchange rate crisis. So last week we're having an exchange rate crisis. Then he's hopping into me about constitutional change, saying that he's not going to be strung up by my hang-ups about the English-Irish issue and Jack Lang and everything else. Mr Speaker, none of this has the opposition focusing on the issues, the broad-based issues of the country as they should be. And let me just say, it was said so nicely by Philip Adams 2 weekends ago in the Australian, where he said, the Liberal Party's phoenix is suddenly a dead budgie that, having toppled from its perch, now lies beaked down in the shell grit. Well, all I can do is endorse those sentiments.
The Honourable Leader of the National Party.
Speaker, my question is directed to the Minister for Development, Cooperation